Shavua Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Rosh Hashanah. We are up to Perek Aleph, Mishnah Daled. Today's Mishnayot should be Leilu Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana Aranbaev, Neriyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Menuchatam beGan Eden, Amen, and Avdi ben Chaim Lechaim, V'derefua Shenamav, Bachabat Esther, and Daniel Shalom ben Rosa, Betor Shah Chorei Israel. We learned earlier that the Beit Din would decide which day is Rosh Chodesh based on the sighting of the moon. People who saw the moon would go to the Beit Din and report their observation to the judges. After determining that the witnesses are eligible to testify and that their testimony is reliable, the judges would declare the date to be Rosh Chodesh. Sometimes it was necessary for witnesses to desecrate Shabbat on their way to the Beit Din. This Mishnah teaches when such desecration is permitted. And the commentaries explain, if the 30th day of the month fell on a Shabbat, witnesses who saw the new moon on Friday night had to travel to the Beit Din on Shabbat because their testimony would be of no use after that Shabbat. In the course of their journey, they might have to desecrate Shabbat, for example, by carrying their supplies of food in a public domain. Desecrating Shabbat for this purpose is permitted by the Torah, as the Mishnah says in chapter 1, Mishnah 9. The sages, however, ruled that witnesses may rely on this permission for only 2 months in the year. The Mishnah begins, excuse me. For 2 months of the year, the witnesses who saw the new moon are allowed to desecrate Shabbat. These months are Nisan and Tishrei. Shebahen ashluchin yotzin Surya. We know that the Kiddush HaChodesh, the sanctification of Rosh Chodesh, is more critical on Nisan and Tishrei than on the other months of the year, because messengers went out on these 2 months to tell the Jews of Syria and other distant communities which they had been declared as Rosh Chodesh. These are the messengers that we mentioned in the previous Mishnah, who traveled to communities far from Yerushalayim, including Syria, to tell them which day had been declared as Rosh Chodesh. Although it was taught there that messengers went out on 6 months of the year, our Mishnah singles out only 2, Nisan and Tishrei, because our Mishnah refers to a particular aspect of sending out the messengers which applied only on those 2 months. On the other 4 months, the messengers set out on their journey at the beginning of the night, as soon as the moon was clearly visible, relying on the assumption that in the daytime when the Beit Din sat, it would declare that day to be Rosh Chodesh. We are not concerned for the small possibility that all the witnesses will be disqualified and Rosh Chodesh will be delayed until the next day. But in the cases of Nisan and Tishrei, when it is essential to know the exact day of Rosh Chodesh in order to establish when the holidays will fall, like the Mishnah says next, the messengers did not leave until after the declaration had actually been made and there was no longer any room for doubt. Since Nisan and Tishrei were treated differently from the other months in this respect, it is apparent that determining the exact day of Rosh Chodesh was more important on these 2 months than on the others. And similarly, the rabbis allowed the witnesses to desecrate Shabbat as permitted by biblical law only for the sake of Nisan and Tishrei and not for any other months of the year. Ubahen mitakinin et hamoadot. The reason why these months are so important is that through the witnesses' testimonies about them, the Beit Din would establish not only the dates of Rosh Chodesh, but also the dates of all the biblical festivals. The festival of Pesach and the festival of the Shavuot, which occurs a fixed number of days after Pesach, depend on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and the festivals of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot depend on Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. Now, this law that witnesses are allowed to desecrate Shabbat only for the months of Nisan and Tishrei did not apply until after the temple was destroyed. The law was different when it still existed. However, when the temple was standing, witnesses were allowed to desecrate Shabbat not only for Nisan and Tishrei, but even for all the other months of the year, because of the need to determine when the Musaf offering of Rosh Chodesh had to be brought. In the time of the temple, it was a biblical obligation to bring the Musaf offering on Rosh Chodesh. Since this obligation is biblical, the rabbis allowed the witnesses to rely on the biblical law and desecrate Shabbat for every Rosh Chodesh, so that the offering would be brought on the day the new moon was seen. And that is the end of Mishnah Dal. Mishnah Hey continues, Ben Shenir'a Ba'alil, Ben Shlo Nir'a Ba'alil, Mechalin Alav et Shabbat. whether the new moon was clearly visible because it was high above the horizon, or was not clearly visible because it was close to the horizon and hard to see due to the glare of the setting sun. Witnesses may desecrate Shabbat to travel to Yerushalayim and testify about it. Now, if the moon was not clearly visible, witnesses may certainly desecrate Shabbat to come and testify about it, because there is a significant chance that no one else will do so. This Tana holds that even if the moon was clearly visible, witnesses may desecrate Shabbat as permitted under biblical law, despite the fact that their testimony will probably not be necessary. Although the rabbis held that the biblical leniency should not be applied in every situation, they allowed desecration of Shabbat in this case. They were concerned that if witnesses would be prevented from coming when the moon is clearly visible, they might be discouraged from coming at any time, even when the moon is not so visible. So to prevent this, they allow witnesses to come in all cases, regardless of the moon's degree of visibility. Rabbi Yossi, however, Rabbi Yossi says, Im nira ba'alil en mecharin rav the Shabbat. If it was clearly visible, they may not desecrate Shabbat to travel to Yerushalayim and testify about it, because it was surely seen in Yerushalayim as well, and their testimony is unlikely to be needed. According to Rabbi Yossi, the rabbis did not allow witnesses to desecrate Shabbat unless there is a significant chance that their testimony will be used. And the Rav does tell us, Ve'en halacha Rabbi Yossi, the halacha does not follow the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. And that is the Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Everybody should have a Shavua Tov. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.